The house was all glass, steel, and engineered quiet, like someone had poured money into a shape and told it to never breathe too loudly. Most nights, I liked it that way. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't remind me of what I couldn't undo. My name sat on the gate in brushed metal Knox Mercer like a brand, not a person. The headlines always loved the same 3 words: tech billionaire, AI security. They wrote about my company like it was a fortress for the modern world. They called me a visionary strategist. They called me impenetrable. They liked the myth that I never lost control. The truth was simpler and uglier. Control wasn't a personality trait. It was my damage management system. 11 years ago, my younger brother died in an accident everyone politely called preventable. I called it what it was: a failure that could have been stopped by a single different decision, by someone paying closer attention, by someone being less certain that tomorrow was guaranteed. After that, I stopped letting people close enough to matter. No serious relationships, no holidays with family, no rooms full of laughter that could vanish in a phone call. Work became both distraction and armor. And the mansion became the extension of that armor: minimal staff, strict boundaries, policies written like contracts. I didn't want warmth. Warmth felt like risk. The staff understood quickly. They moved like shadows, efficient and silent. I paid for professionalism, and I got it. No one spoke unless necessary. No one lingered. Then Sienna Hayes arrived. I noticed her the way I noticed a subtle flaw in a perfect system, not because she stood out, but because 7, recently hired, soft-spoken, background in early childhood education, an odd pivot to private domestic work. She didn't carry herself like someone looking for a rich employer to save her. She carried herself like someone trying to stay invisible long enough to survive. She cleaned without leaving a trace. She learned the house fast. She never asked for anything. If I'm honest, I liked that. I didn't want to be needed. On a Thursday evening, I came home early, an investor dinner canceled without warning, a rare opening in my schedule. The ocean air hit the driveway, cold, salty, sharp. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual calm. My footsteps barely echoed on the stone. I should have gone straight to my office. That was the routine. But as I moved through the lower hallway, past the service corridor that led to the utility wing, I heard something that didn't belong. It wasn't a scream, not even a sob the way movies sell them. It was smaller, tighter, like someone had put a hand over their own mouth and was still losing anyway. I stopped. The sound came again, controlled and broken at the same time, the kind of cry that wasn't meant to be heard. That was what startled me most. People usually perform their pain. They raise it like a flag, hoping someone will witness it and owe them something. This wasn't that. It was the sound of a person trying to disappear while falling apart. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not sympathy, not exactly. Something closer to recognition, like hearing a familiar song in a room you never expected it to play. I took one step closer, then another, and then I froze. The door to the laundry wing was closed, but not fully sealed. A thin line of light cut the floor. I didn't open it. I didn't speak. I just stood there, listening like a man trying to figure out whether the world had changed or whether he had. A minute passed, maybe 2. The sound slowed, choked back, forced into silence. Whoever was inside wasn't done hurting, they were just done letting it show. The door opened. Sienna stepped out with a folded stack of papers pressed to her chest. Her hair was tied back, too neat for someone who'd been crying. Her face was composed, but her eyes like she'd been underwater and had just surfaced. She didn't see me immediately. When she did, her posture tightened for half a second, like she'd been caught stealing something. Then her expression settled into professionalism, so fast it would have fooled anyone who didn't know what they just heard. "Miss Mercer," she said quietly. Her voice was steady. That was the thing. The words were fine. Her control was fine. But underneath it, there was a tremor like a fault line trying to stay hidden. I should have nodded and kept walking. That's what I always did. That's what the house expected of me. Instead, the words came out before I could stop them. Are you all right? The question sounded wrong in my mouth, like I'd borrowed it from someone else. Her gaze dropped to the papers. Yes, sir. Just personal matters. Personal matters. I repeated, tasting how vague it was. She offered a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Won't affect my work. There it was, the reflex to reassure, to promise usefulness, to prove she wasn't a problem. That hit me harder than the crying, because I knew that reflex. I'd worn it like a suit after my brother died, telling people I was fine, because being fine made me easier to tolerate. I looked at the papers again. Hospital letterhead. I caught it in the corner before she shifted her grip. Something moved in my mind, a memory trying to climb out of the dark waiting rooms, forms, insurance denials, the sound of machines beeping while someone you love slips farther away. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't offer help. I did nothing that could be mistaken for intimacy. Good. I said, too cold, too clip. Make sure it doesn't. She flinched like she'd been slapped with a word, not a hand. The smile vanished. Of course, sir. She passed me, walking quickly, shoulders squared, the papers held tight like armor. I watched her disappear down the corridor, and something in me hated myself for the way I'd spoken. I went to my office and sat at my desk, staring at a screen that held nothing important. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel clean anymore. It felt staged. Like silence wasn't peace, just suppression. Then my phone vibrated. A security notification, routine system scan, except one detail jumped out, flapped out from the estate landline earlier that day. A call placed to a hospital billing department. I stared at the timestamp. It was during Sienna's shift. The twist wasn't that she had a crisis. The twist was that she'd used the house line, meaning she didn't want a record on her own phone, meaning she was hiding something even deeper than debt. I leaned back, jaw tight, the ocean visible through my window like a cold eye watching. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I didn't care. But the truth was, I couldn't unhear the sound of her trying not to break. And when night fell again, I didn't go to my office. I went to the service corridor and waited, quietly, deliberately, ready to confirm what was happening in my house and what it was awakening in me. As the clock hit 147, the restrained crying returned, except this time, it wasn't coming from the laundry wing. It was coming from somewhere much closer to my office door. Knox Mercer had built his empire on identifying patterns. Algorithms, behavioral signals, market shifts, nothing moved randomly. Everything repeated if someone watched closely enough. And now there was a new pattern inside his own house. The sound of hidden grief. Soft, restrained, disciplined. It had embedded itself in his mind like corrupted code. The night after I heard it outside my office corridor, I didn't pretend I was working late. I altered my routine intentionally. I closed my laptop earlier than usual, left the upper floor dark, and remained downstairs where the service wing branched off like a quiet artery. I told myself I was verifying security timing. That was the lie. At 1:47 p.m., almost to the minute, the sound returned. Not near my office this time. Not misplaced. It was back where I first heard it, the lower utility corridor. I moved without thinking, my footsteps controlled. The door to the laundry wing was partially open again. Light spilled through the narrow gap, cutting a line across the polished floor. Through it, I saw her. Sienna sat on the small wooden bench beside the folding table. Papers were spread across her lap and the dryer lid, white sheets stamped with hospital logos and red notices. Her shoulders curved inward, as if bracing against invisible impact. Her head was bowed, hair falling forward, and she pressed her fingers against her eyes the way people do when they're trying to physically hold themselves together. There was no audience, no phone camera, no dramatics, just exhaustion. She wasn't crying loudly. It was controlled, like she had trained herself to release pain in measured breaths. That detail unsettled me more than anything. Pain that had learned discipline was pain that had been around for a long time. I stepped back before she could see me. In my office later, I didn't open financial dashboards. I opened her file. Sienna Hayes. Hired 6 months ago. Strong references. A noticeable employment gap before relocation. Former teaching assistant in Denver. Sudden move to California listed as family medical necessity. The phrase irritated me. It was vague by design. I picked up my phone and contacted my private security director. Run a discreet back review on an employee, I said, quietly. He didn't ask why. He never did. By morning, a preliminary report was on my encrypted tablet. Her mother, Danielle Hayes, age 53, diagnosed with progressive multiple sclerosis 5 years earlier. Condition worsening rapidly in the past 12 months. Insurance appeal pending after coverage denial for advanced treatment. Uncovered medical debt $214,000. I stared at the number. $214,000. I spent more than that upgrading my home server infrastructure last quarter. I had authorized that without blinking. Yet that number was currently crushing a 27-year-old woman who cleaned my floors. The report continued. Credit score declining. 2 maxed out cards. Multiple late payment notices. Emergency relocation likely triggered by loss of support network. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No suspicious activity. Just pressure. I closed the tablet and leaned back. The amount was negligible to me. Catastrophic to her. Over the next few days, I observed her the way I would analyze a system under stress. She skipped staff meals consistently, claiming she wasn't hungry. Her paycheck was deposited every other Friday and transferred out within hours, full balance, minus minimal personal expenses. Her purchases were bare essentials. No subscriptions, no indulgences, not even coffee deliveries. Chronic fatigue showed in the smallest ways. Slower movements by late afternoon. Slight tremor in her hands when lifting heavy linens. A momentary pause before climbing stairs. One afternoon, she carried a crate of cleaning supplies across the back hallway. I was reviewing renovation proposals in the adjoining room when I heard a soft thud. Not a fall. A catch. I stepped into the hall. She had stumbled, one knee nearly touching the floor, fingers gripping the wall for balance. The crate tilted dangerously. Careful, I said, sharper than intended. She straightened instantly, forcing steadiness. I'm fine. Breathing was uneven. You look exhausted, I added. A flash of something crossed her face, not anger, not defensiveness. Shame. I won't let it interfere with my work, she said quickly. I know this position requires consistency. There it was again, the reflex to prove usefulness. I studied her for a moment too long. This position requires stability, I corrected quietly. She blinked, confused by the difference. I'm stable, she insisted. The lie hung between us, thin and fragile. After she walked away, I stood alone in that hallway longer than necessary. Because I recognized it. Survival without complaint. Strength without audience. I had done the same thing at 28, sitting in hospital corridors pretending I wasn't terrified. Pretending I could outwork death. Pretending if I just negotiated harder with doctors and insurers, my brother would still be here. I failed then. No amount of money or leverage could reverse what had already happened. But this was different. This was a slow collapse, not a sudden one. And it was happening under my roof. On the 3rd day after reviewing the report, I made a decision. Not emotional, strategic, quiet. I authorized a call to the hospital billing department through one of my foundation's legal intermediaries. I did not sign my name. I did not attach my company. I simply asked for confirmation of the outstanding balance and the timeline before escalation to collections. The answer was blunt. 72 hours. That same afternoon, while I was in my office pretending to review quarterly projections, the estate landline rang downstairs. I heard the faint echo of it through the open corridor. Moments later, I heard Sienna's footsteps. Quick, hesitant, she answered. I couldn't hear the full conversation from where I stood, but I caught fragments drifting upward through the quiet architecture. Yes, this is she. A pause. I don't understand. Another pause. Longer. That can't be right. Silence. When I stepped into the hallway, she was standing perfectly still beside the console table, the receiver pressed to her ear, her face drained of color. Her free hand trembled. I'm sorry, she whispered into the phone. Can you repeat that? She wasn't crying. She wasn't breathing either. I realized in that moment that the call she was receiving was the result of the decision I had made that morning. But the confusion in her expression told me something else. The billing department wasn't calling to demand payment. They were calling to tell her something that made no logical sense at all. And as I watched her grip the edge of the table to steady herself, I understood that within the next few seconds, her entire reality was about to shift. When she slowly turned and looked up the staircase, directly at me, there was only one word in her eyes. Why? She prepared for another warning. I could see it in the way her shoulders squared when she left the estate that morning. The hospital had requested her presence in person, which usually meant escalation, collections, legal review, something final. She didn't know I had already set events in motion. From my office window, I watched her car disappear down the winding drive. For a moment, I almost called the foundation attorney to pause the transfer. Almost. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about intervention without humiliation, precision without exposure. An hour later, my encrypted phone vibrated. Payment confirmed, my legal intermediary said. Full balance processed. Anonymous private trust. Cleared as of 9:12 a.m. No irregularities. I asked. None. It's airtight. That was important. No public filings tied to Mercer Industries. No philanthropic press release. The funds had been routed through layered foundations I'd built years ago for acquisition shielding. This was simply a redirection of infrastructure, not charity. Correction of imbalance. That's what I told myself. Around noon, my security feed alerted me to movement in the hospital administrative wing. I don't usually monitor employees, but I had accessed temporary public hallway cameras under legal clearance earlier that morning. I justified it as risk management. I saw her walk into the billing office. Her posture was braced for impact. I imagined the script she had rehearsed in her mind: negotiate for more time, plead for installment adjustments, promise increased payments. Instead, 23 minutes later, she walked out like someone who had just stepped into a different gravity. Her movements were slow. Disoriented, she stopped in the hallway and gripped the strap of her bag, looking down at a document in her hand. Later, she would tell the billing officer, "There must be a mistake. I didn't authorize anything." The woman behind the desk had shaken her head. "There's no mistake, Miss Hayes. The full balance has been satisfied by a private trust. It's complete. And the donor. Confidential." I wasn't in the room, but I could hear it as if I had been. That word, confidential, can feel like mercy or menace, depending on who receives it. When she returned to the estate that evening, I was in the living room reviewing contracts I wasn't reading. She entered quietly, as always. But something was different. She wasn't weighed down. She was unsettled. Her eyes found me briefly as she passed, not long enough to accuse, just long enough to measure. I kept my expression neutral. "Everything all right?" I asked, careful, controlled. She hesitated. "Yes," she said slowly. "The hospital resolved something." Resolved. I studied her face. She nodded, but her gaze lingered a second too long. "They said it was an anonymous trust." She added. My pulse didn't shift. The years of negotiations had trained me well. "Generous?" I replied evenly. "Yes," she said, almost to herself. "Generous." She walked away, but I could feel the question trailing behind her like static. Why? That evening, I reviewed the transaction records again, not because I doubted them, but because I needed to see the proof of action. $214,000. Cleared. Finalized. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was reacting to loss. I felt proactive. Like I had intercepted something before it collapsed. It didn't bring my brother back. It didn't soften the memory of the hospital hallway where I stood 11 years ago with a different invoice in my hand. But it was movement. Upstairs, sometime past midnight, I noticed something else. Silence. Not the suffocating kind. The house felt lighter. The next morning, I came downstairs earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the glass walls, turning the ocean silver. Sienna was in the kitchen, reviewing a small stack of mail. She looked rested. It was subtle. The tightness around her mouth had eased. The dark circles under her eyes had softened. "You're here early," she said, surprised. "So are you," I replied. A faint smile flickered. "I slept. It sounded like a confession?" "Good," I said. She hesitated, then added quietly, "I haven't done that in months." There was no performance in her tone, just disbelief. Later, I overheard her on her personal phone in the garden, speaking softly. "No, Mom. It's real. They confirmed it twice." A pause. "I don't know who," they won't say. Another pause. "No, I didn't ask anyone here." That last sentence landed heavier than she intended. I felt it from across the lawn. She didn't ask anyone here, which meant she didn't see me as someone who would help. That shouldn't have mattered. But it did. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. My CFO, Darren Cole, stopped by unannounced. He had noticed a large withdrawal routed through one of our dormant foundations. "We're not in acquisition mode," he said, reviewing numbers on his tablet. "This transfer doesn't align with strategy." "It aligns with mine," I replied. He raised an eyebrow. "Philanthropy. Risk mitigation." "For what risk?" I looked at him evenly. "Human instability inside controlled environments." He studied me carefully. "You're talking about staff? I'm talking about structural weakness," I corrected. He gave a thin smile. "Careful knocks. When you start solving personal crises, people assume you're soft." The word lingered. Soft. I built an empire avoiding that label. After he left, I stood alone in the foyer, watching Sienna move through the corridor with lighter steps. She wasn't crying anymore. But she was watching me now. Not with suspicion. With calculation. Relief had created confusion. If someone erased a catastrophe without asking for gratitude, without requesting repayment, without even stepping forward to claim credit, what did they want? That question would eventually push her toward an answer I hadn't anticipated. Because eliminating debt removed pressure. It didn't eliminate vulnerability. And as I watched her fold fresh linens with steady hands, I understood something unsettling. I hadn't finished what I started. $214,000 solved the present. It did nothing for the future. If her mother's condition worsened again, we would be right back here, just with different numbers. I walked into my office and closed the door. On my desk sat the expanded medical portfolio for one of my research divisions, neurological AI diagnostics. I stared at it for a long time. Then I made another call. "This isn't about a one-time settlement," I said quietly. "I want long-term stabilization." There was a pause on the other end. "That will require restructuring," my advisor replied. "I know." When I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar. Not generosity, responsibility. And that was far more dangerous. Because responsibility means proximity, and proximity means risk. Downstairs, I heard Sienna's footsteps approach my office door, hesitant, then steady. She knocked softly. I looked up. This time, she wasn't holding in voices. She was holding something else entirely. When she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the question in her eyes wasn't about money anymore. It was about trust. Erasing a crisis solves the present, but securing a future requires intention. That thought followed me the morning Sienna knocked on my office door. She stepped inside slowly, closing it behind her as if the hallway itself might overhear. There was no accusation in her expression now. No panic. Just steady curiosity. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "You already have it," I replied. She held my gaze longer than usual. "I know you value transparency in this house." "I do." She inhaled carefully. "Then I need to say something. I don't know who paid my mother's medical balance, but I know it wasn't random." Silence stretched between us. "I didn't ask for help," she continued. "But whoever didn't humiliate me. They didn't make it public. They didn't ask for gratitude." Her voice softened. "That matters. I didn't confirm anything. I didn't deny it." She watched me for a reaction I refused to give. "I just needed to say thank you," she finished quietly. "To the air, I guess, the air." That was as close as she would come. After she left, I authorized the second phase. Human Resources drafted a revised contract under the category of performance-based adjustment. The paperwork was clinical: significant salary increase, expanded medical coverage extending to immediate family, flexible scheduling to accommodate hospital visits. When I reviewed the final draft, I added one line personally discretionary wellness allocation. No explanation attached. When she was called into HR, I monitored the meeting remotely, not for control, but for confirmation. There must be a mistake, she said when the numbers were presented. There isn't, the director replied. Your performance has exceeded expectations. I watched her process it, confusion first, then hesitation, then something fragile, hope trying not to overreach. Is this because of? She began. It's policy, the director interrupted smoothly. You've earned it. Earned. That word protected her dignity. Later that evening, she found me in the kitchen. I don't understand this, she said, holding the contract carefully like it might dissolve. You've been consistent. I answered. Consistency is valuable. Her eyes searched mine. This is more than consistent. Stability benefits everyone under this roof, I said evenly. That wasn't the full truth. But it wasn't a lie either. Within weeks, the impact became visible. Her mother gained access to advanced therapy centers previously denied under insurance constraints. A higher-tier neurologist took over Danielle Hayes's case. Treatment shifted from reactive to strategic. And Sienna began to change. She ate with the staff again instead of claiming she wasn't hungry. She no longer transferred every dollar immediately. I saw small purchases appear, groceries beyond necessity, a new winter coat. She slept. You could see it in her posture. In the way she walked through the hallway without bracing for impact. In the way her laughter, rare but real, echoed once in the garden when a maintenance worker told a story. The late-night crying stopped. The mansion felt different. For years, silence in that house had felt engineered. Now it felt earned. I found myself reviewing my Fellopic portfolio late one evening, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Millions allocated to research initiatives. Grants structured for tax optimization. Strategic giving. I realized something uncomfortable. I had always treated philanthropy like investment, measured, detached, return-based. What I did for Sienna was different. It wasn't scalable. It wasn't marketable. It was specific, personal. I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years, medical records from my brother's final hospitalization. I stared at the notes, the insurance denials, the timing of decisions I replayed endlessly. I had convinced myself detachment made me stronger. But helping her hadn't weakened me. It had stabilized something inside me I didn't know was still unstable. Weeks later, I discovered something unexpected. In the staff logbook, a simple leather-bound binder used to note maintenance updates and shift changes, there was a handwritten entry that didn't fit. I recognized her handwriting immediately. It read to whoever believes quiet intervention matters, it does. You may never see what you changed, but it was more than numbers. No signature. No names, just that. I closed the logbook slowly. She hadn't cornered me. Hadn't forced acknowledgement. She left gratitude where it could exist without pressure. Something unfamiliar surfaced in me then. Responsibility beyond business. Not responsibility for profit. Not responsibility for reputation. Responsibility for impact. That realization should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt dangerous. Because the more I allowed proximity to human vulnerability, the more I reopened my own. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, I heard my phone vibrate during a board call. I ignored it, it vibrated again and again. I glanced at the screen. Sienna. She had never called me directly before. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway before answering. Mr. Mercer, she said, her voice stripped of the steadiness I had grown used to. I'm so sorry to call you like this. What happened? There was a pause filled with hospital noise in the background. My mom collapsed during therapy. They think it's a severe relapse. They're running scans. The word relapse landed like a crack through glass. She stopped responding for a few minutes. Sienna continued, breath unsteady. They're not sure what this means yet. I felt the old memory rise, the sterile hallway. The doctor walking toward me with a look that said everything before he spoke. Which hospital? I asked, already moving. She told me, I'll handle logistics, I said. Focus on being there. There was a silence on the line, heavier than any gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. The question wasn't suspicious this time. It was wounded. I swallowed. Because stability doesn't end at paperwork, the line went quiet. When I hung up, I didn't feel strategic. I felt exposed. Because this wasn't about invoices anymore. This was about whether intervention could outrun deterioration. And as I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, one thought pressed against my chest harder than the rest. What if this time money still wasn't enough? By the time I reached the hospital, the neurologist was already asking to speak with me privately, without Sienna in the room. Wealth could erase debt, but it could not promise survival. By the time I reached the hospital, Danielle Hayes was already in respiratory distress. Sienna met me in the corridor outside the critical care unit. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, like the confidence she'd rebuilt over the past few weeks had collapsed in a single afternoon. "They had to intubate her," she said, her voice hollow. Her oxygen levels dropped too fast. The fluorescent lighting made everything look colder than it was. Or maybe that was memory creeping in. "Where's the attending physician?" I asked. "They're running more tests." They said the MS progressed aggressively. They don't know if it triggered something else. Prognosis uncertain. Those words don't scream. They suffocate. I stepped aside and made 3 calls in under 5 minutes. First, to the director of a private neurological institute in San Francisco, a facility that specialized in high-risk progressive cases. Second, to an air medical transport service. Third, to my legal counsel to clear expedited transfer authorizations. Influence moves quickly when applied without hesitation. Within 40 minutes, the hospital administrator was standing with us. "There's been a transfer request," he said carefully, glancing between us. "This is highly unusual." Sienna looked at me then, not confused, not grateful. "Aware you did this," she said quietly. "This facility isn't equipped for what's happening," I replied. "She needs specialists who handle aggressive neurological deterioration daily." Her jaw tightened. "And how exactly does a transfer like that happen in under an hour?" I held her gaze. "It happens when you don't wait." She didn't argue. She didn't thank me. She just nodded, because when someone you love is struggling to breathe, pride becomes irrelevant. The transport was swift. Too swift. Danielle was moved under heavy monitoring to the Neurological Institute before midnight. When we arrived, the difference was immediate. Private ICU wing, advanced imaging suites, a team already briefed on her case before she crossed the threshold. Sienna stopped just inside the unit doors, scanning the surroundings. "This isn't normal care," she whispered. "No," I said. "It's necessary care." She turned to me slowly. "Knox, how many strings are you pulling?" "As many as it takes." There was no arrogance in that answer, just urgency. The lead neurologist approached us, a composed woman in her early 40s with sharp, assessing eyes. "Danielle Hayes is experiencing acute respiratory failure likely linked to rapid demyelination progression," she explained. "There's pressure near the brainstem. If we don't intervene surgically, she may not regain independent breathing function." Sienna's hand gripped the back of a chair. "Surgery," she repeated. "It's high risk," the doctor continued. "But without it, her condition will deteriorate quickly." High risk, the phrase echoed like a trigger. I had heard it before, in another hallway, in another hospital, standing beside a different person I couldn't save. Sienna looked at me, not for permission, but for steadiness. "What are her chances?" she asked. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. 40%. 40% survival. 60% loss. I felt my pulse in my throat. Sienna swallowed. "Do it," she said. No dramatic breakdown. No collapse. Just resolve. As they prepared Danielle for surgery, Sienna sat beside the ICU window, staring through the glass as nurses worked around her mother's still body. "I thought we were past this," she murmured. "We are," I said quietly. "We're past the debt. We're not past the disease." She let out a brittle laugh. "You can negotiate with banks. You can't negotiate with this." Her words weren't accusatory. They were factual. And they sliced deeper than blame. When the surgical team wheeled Danielle toward the operating suite, Sienna leaned down and pressed her forehead gently against her mother's hand. "I'm here," she whispered. I stepped back, giving her space, but not distance. The doors closed. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. I monitored updates from a private lounge the Institute provided. Screens displayed vitals, surgical progress reports, imaging scans, technology everywhere. Control nowhere. Memories resurfaced without invitation. My brother's final hours. The way machines had beeped in mechanical rhythm while doctors adjusted tubes and whispered outside the room. The way I had stood convinced that money, persuasion, and sheer willpower could bend reality. They hadn't. I had buried that helplessness under acquisitions and data models. Tonight it was breathing again. At 20:47 a.m., a nurse approached. "There are complications," she said carefully. "The pressure isn't responding the way we hoped." Sienna closed her eyes. I stepped forward. "What does that mean?" "It means they're adjusting the approach." Adjusting, another word that hides fear. Sienna's composure began to fracture. "I can't lose her," she said, barely audible. I wanted to promise something, anything, but I had learned the cost of false certainty. So instead I sat beside her. For the first time in years, I didn't manage a crisis from a distance. I stayed. At 30:18 a.m., the operating room doors opened. The lead surgeon stepped out, mask lowered, expression unreadable. Sienna stood before he even reached us. "Tell me," she said. The surgeon looked between us, then exhaled slowly. "We were able to relieve the immediate pressure," he began. "She's stable for now." The words should have felt like victory. But the pause after stable lingered too long. "There's more," I said quietly. He nodded. "The progression is faster than we anticipated." The surgery bought time. It did not stop the disease. Sienna swayed slightly, but didn't fall. "How much time?" she asked. The surgeon's eyes softened. "We need to talk about long-term intervention options. Experimental therapies. Aggressive trials, experimental, aggressive, risk layered on risk." He turned to me directly. "These programs aren't typically accessible without significant backing." The implication was clear. I felt the weight of it settle. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about whether I was willing to step further into responsibility than I ever had before. Sienna looked at me, not pleading, just searching. And for the first time since my brother died, I allowed myself to fully feel it. The fear of losing someone again. The surgeon's next sentence would force a decision that could either save Danielle or expose a secret about my past I had never told anyone. Survival does not erase fear, it demands growth. Danielle Hayes survived the surgery. That word survived echoed differently than stable. Stable felt temporary. Survived felt earned. When the surgeon confirmed she was out of immediate danger, Sienna didn't thank anyone. She didn't speak at all. She just pressed her hand to her mouth and let the tears fall without restraint for the first time since I had known her. Not the controlled, silent tears in the utility corridor. These were raw, unmanaged, relief breaking through days of suspended breath. I stood beside her in the surgical waiting area, feeling something dangerously close to redemption. Not because I had saved someone. I hadn't. The doctors had. Science had. Timing had. But I had not stood back this time. I had moved. And movement mattered. The long recovery ahead was outlined in careful medical language: rehabilitation cycles, monitored respiratory therapy, cognitive evaluation, aggressive disease management. The kind of plan that demanded endurance rather than miracles. Sienna stayed at the Institute for days, sleeping in a chair beside her mother's bed. I visited twice, quietly, making sure she had access to every resource without forcing my presence into her grief. When Danielle was stabilized enough for step-down care, I made additional arrangements: private in-home respiratory support, upgraded monitoring systems, access to a rotating team of specialists. I didn't delegate that to HR. I handled it myself. Back at the estate, I adjusted Sienna's schedule personally. Reduced hours, flexible arrival times, remote administrative assistance options. "You don't have to come in tomorrow," I told her one evening when she stopped by to retrieve some personal items. She shook her head. "I need routine." "You need rest," I corrected. "I can rest when she's stronger," she replied softly. There was no defiance in her tone, just love. Over the next few weeks, something subtle shifted. Sienna slowly regained stability. Her movements were no longer driven by panic. She walked through the mansion with intention rather than survival. The fear hadn't disappeared, it had settled into vigilance. I understood that feeling intimately. Meanwhile, I expanded neurological research funding anonymously through one of my foundations. Not for press, not for tax leverage, for access. I authorized grants to experimental trial programs that focused specifically on aggressive multiple sclerosis progression. I didn't attach Danielle's name. I didn't even attach mine. But I knew. And that knowledge steadied something inside me. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the surgery, Sienna requested a private meeting. Her tone on the phone was calm, direct, no tremor. We met in my office overlooking the ocean. She stood near the window at first, hands clasped loosely in front of her. "My mom is improving," she began, slowly. "But she's breathing on her own. That's good," I said. She turned to face me fully. "I know what you did." I didn't respond. "I don't know the mechanics," she continued. "But I know the pattern." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "What pattern?" "The kind of access that doesn't exist for people like us," she said quietly. "Transfers that happen in hours. Specialists who rearrange their schedules. Trial programs suddenly open." There was no bitterness in her voice, just clarity. "And?" I asked. "And I need you to understand something," she said. "I don't feel owned." That word landed heavier than accusation ever could have. "I didn't do this to own you," I replied evenly. "I know," she said. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the old silence, the suffocating one. It felt grounded. "I feel seen," she added. That was unexpected. Seen. "I've worked in places before where people like me were invisible," she continued. "Where if something went wrong, it was assumed we mismanaged it. Where help came with strings." Her jaw tightened slightly, as if recalling something painful. This didn't. I held her gaze. "Good." She studied me for a moment. "You don't talk about your brother?" she said gently. The statement caught me off guard. "I don't need to," I replied. "Maybe you don't," she said. "But I think this is about him." The room felt smaller suddenly. I hadn't told her details. "But grief leaves fingerprints in how you move. I couldn't save him," I said finally. The words felt like breaking glass. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't minimize it. "You saved my mom time," she said instead. "Time matters." That simple, that devastating. I nodded once. Neither confirmed nor denied the specifics. We didn't need to. A mutual understanding formed in that space, one built on quiet recognition rather than obligation. After she left, I remained seated for a long time, watching the ocean crash rhythmically against the cliffs. The mansion no longer felt hollow. The silence had changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was calm. Staff laughter in the kitchen no longer irritated me. The sound of footsteps in the hallway didn't feel intrusive. The house felt lived in. I didn't realize how much of my own isolation I had constructed until I felt it loosening. Weeks turned into months. Danielle progressed slowly but steadily through therapy. Sienna returned to more consistent hours at the estate, though I never reinstated her original schedule. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sienna paused near the foyer. "Do you ever think about what comes after survival?" she asked. "All the time," I said. She nodded, as if confirming something internally. "I have," she replied. There was something different in her eyes then. Not fear, not gratitude. Decision. I didn't press. I assumed she was processing trauma, considering rest, perhaps planning to relocate closer to a medical facility. I did not anticipate what she would say 3 weeks later, because growth doesn't just stabilize. It changes direction. And when she knocked on my office door again months later, holding a sealed envelope instead of medical paperwork, I understood instinctively that, this time, the shift would not be about crisis. It would be about choice. When she handed me the envelope and said she had been accepted somewhere, I realized the one outcome I had prepared for was losing her by her own design. True generosity does not bind someone closer, it gives them the power to leave. When Sienna handed me the envelope that afternoon, I knew it wasn't another medical update. The paper was thicker, official, intentional. I wasn't going to say anything until it was certain, she said, standing across from my desk. Her voice was steady, but there was a brightness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not relief, not survival. Ambition. I opened an envelope. Graduate program acceptance. Pediatric neuro rehabilitation. Stanford Medical Sciences Division. For a moment, I didn't speak. You have finally, months ago, she replied. After my mom stabilized, I looked up at her. You didn't mention it. I didn't know if I would get in, she said. And I didn't want hope to distract me from what was in front of me. That sounded familiar. The discipline of withholding joy until it was secure. When does it start? I asked. Fall semester. 3 months and audited once, controlled. That's impressive, I said. She smiled softly. It's terrifying. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. You want to specialize in the same field that almost took your mother. Yes. There was no hesitation. I spent years feeling helpless, she continued. Watching doctors speak in terms I didn't understand. Watching decisions get delayed because insurance said no. I don't want to stand on that side of the room again. Her gaze didn't waver. I want to be the person who understands the progression before it escalates. The person who advocates before someone's breathing fails. Her words were calm, direct. Stability created opportunity. Crisis no longer defined her. And suddenly, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Resistance. Not logical resistance. Not strategic. Personal. You're resigning, I said quietly. Yes, the word didn't tremble. I'm giving you full notice, she added. I'll stay through the transition. Train someone new. The estate had operated differently since she arrived. More human. Less sterile. Her presence had altered the atmosphere in ways I hadn't quantified until now. This house will manage, I said evenly. She tilted her head slightly. Will you? The question disarmed me. I was managing long before you arrived, I replied. That's not what I meant. Silence filled the office. You taught me something, she continued. Fat intervention doesn't have to be loud. That dignity matters. I want to carry that forward. I exhaled slowly. And you think staying here prevents that? I think staying here keeps me safe, she said. But I don't need safety anymore. There it was. Growth. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Pacific. Most people would stay, I said. Security. Stability. Resources, I know, she replied softly. That's why I have to leave. I turned back to face her. You're not obligated to explain ambition, I said. I'm not explaining, she answered. I'm honoring. That word struck deeper than gratitude ever had. I nodded once. Your resignation is accepted. I said. Her shoulders relaxed, but not in relief. In confirmation, I'll ensure your tuition is covered, I added. Her expression shifted immediately. Knox, it's not charity, I interrupted gently. It's investment. In someone who will outgrow this house. She hesitated. I can't owe you forever. You don't, I said. The funding will be structured as an independent scholarship under the foundation. No strings. No visibility. She studied me carefully, searching for hidden terms. There aren't any, I assured her. After a long pause, she nodded. Thank you. Over the next 3 months, the estate adjusted. A new hire was trained. Sienna documented processes meticulously. She moved through the house differently now, not as someone surviving, but as someone transitioning. On her final day, she arrived early. The morning light poured through the glass walls, casting long reflections across the marble floors. She walked slowly through each corridor, not nostalgically, but intentionally. She paused at the utility wing, the same place where I had first heard her brake. She didn't look small there anymore. I met her in the foyer near noon. Her belongings fit into 2 modest suitcases. That's it? I asked. She smiled. Turns out I don't need much. We stood facing each other in the space that had once felt impenetrable. You changed the trajectory of my life, she said quietly. You changed mine. I replied before I could stop myself. Her eyes softened, but she didn't romanticize it. You didn't rescue me, she said. You gave me room. I nodded. Intervention was not ownership. Mercy releases control. I extended my hand. She looked at it for a second, then stepped forward instead and hugged me. Not tightly. Not desperately. Just firmly enough to acknowledge shared history. When she pulled back, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward the doors with confidence. No longer invisible, no longer braced for collapse. Just moving forward. I watched her car disappear down the same winding drive I had once watched her leave for the hospital. The estate felt quiet again. But not hollow. Different. Lighter. I returned to my office and sat down at my desk. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with work. I let it exist. Time moved the way it always does, quietly, without permission. The foundation expanded. Research initiatives matured. Danielle continued her therapy with measured progress. I did not hear from Sienna beyond a brief confirmation of enrollment. And then, 5 years later, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, my assistant placed an envelope on my desk. No return address. Handwritten. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Sienna Hayes. My pulse shifted in a way I hadn't expected after so much time. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. Because some letters carry updates, and some carry transformation. When I finally opened it, the first photograph inside forced me to confront just how far her decision had truly taken her and what it meant for the next chapter of my life. The greatest transformations are never televised, they unfold quietly and endure. 5 years is long enough for a house to change its echo. After Sienna left, I didn't replace her presence with noise. I replaced it with structure that meant something. The Mercer Foundation expanded in ways the media barely noticed. Neurological research grants increased threefold, but without press conferences. Caregiver support programs launched quietly in 3 states, stipends for families who had fallen into the same bureaucratic gaps Sienna once navigated alone. I reduced high-risk acquisitions in my primary company. Analysts called it conservative repositioning. They speculated burnout. They speculated distraction. They were wrong. It wasn't caution. It was recalibration. I stopped chasing volatility for adrenaline. I started investing in prevention. There's a difference between building empires and stabilizing lives. The mansion changed too. Not physically, the glass walls still faced the Pacific. The steel still caught the light the same way at sunset. But the silence inside it no longer felt engineered. It felt intentional. One late afternoon, the 5 years after Sienna walked down that driveway with 2 suitcases and a future, my assistant placed an envelope on my desk. No return address, she said. Handwritten. I knew before I touched it. The handwriting was sharper now, more confident, but still unmistakably hers. For a moment, I didn't open it. I stood and walked to the window instead, looking out over the ocean the way I had that day she left. The Pacific rolled in steady, indifferent waves. Time does that. It moves without apology. Then I opened the envelope. A photograph slid out first. Sienna stood in a brightly lit pediatric therapy center. Not in scrubs, but in professional attire, sleeves rolled up. Around her were children, small, fragile bodies connected to adaptament and monitored devices. She wasn't behind them. She was kneeling at eye level with a little girl gripping parallel bars, guiding her hands gently but firmly. Not rescuing, empowering. On the back of the photo, in careful ink, she had written, "You were right. Stability benefits everyone under the roof." I exhaled slowly. Another photo followed. Danielle Hayes sat in a specialized mobility chair by a window, sunlight catching silver strands in her hair. She looked older, weaker, but alive. Her posture wasn't collapsing. It was enduring. There was a third photo. A small plaque mounted near a therapy room entrance. Hayes Pediatric Neuro Rehab Wing. Subsidized Care Initiative. I stared at it longer than the others. Dozens of children receiving subsidized care, not through my foundation, through hers. I unfolded the letter last. Knox, I used to believe survival was the finish line. It isn't. It's permission. The program we built here focuses on early intervention for families who would otherwise fall through the cracks. Most of them don't know who you are. They don't need to. What you did for us wasn't about money. It was timing. You stepped in before collapse became permanent. Intervention at the right moment changes trajectory. You once told me stability benefits everyone under your roof. I've tried to build roofs for others. Thank you for giving me room. Sienna, I read it twice. Then I sat down. 5 years ago, I believed my influence existed primarily in markets, in numbers, in expansion. Now I understood it existed in trajectories. I could not save my brother. That truth no longer crushed me the way it once did. But I could prevent other silent collapses. I could fund research before diseases advanced unchecked. I could support caregivers before exhaustion destroyed them. I could intervene before shame forced someone to cry alone in a service corridor. The mansion behind me was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It felt peaceful. The kind of peace that comes from purpose, not absence. I walked back to the window, holding the photograph of Sienna kneeling beside that child. Somewhere else, at that very moment, another unseen struggle was unfolding. Another family calculating impossible numbers under fluorescent light. Another daughter telling herself she wouldn't break because breaking wasn't affordable. The difference now was awareness. I didn't need to hear the sound of hidden grief to know it existed. I pressed the intercom on my desk. Schedule a foundation review. I instructed my assistant. I want an audit of regions with the highest denial rates for neurological claims. There was a pause on the line. Immediately. Yes. I ended the call and looked back at the ocean. 5 years ago, I waited to hear someone cry before I acted. I told myself it was coincidence that I happened to notice. It wasn't. It was hesitation. I won't hesitate again. Because generosity that binds is ego, but generosity that releases and then multiplies is legacy. I placed Sienna's letter carefully in my desk drawer, not hidden, just kept. The house settled around me, not sterile, not guarded, steady, and somewhere beyond these glass walls, another quiet fracture was forming in someone else's life. This time, I would not wait for the sound to reach my hallway. And when the next unseen crisis crossed my path, I would act before silence ever had the chance to break.